And they began to let me get closer and closer. There was a rather scary time as they got used to me, when some of them were treating me as though I was a predator. And, you know, chimpanzees are way stronger than we are. And when they're up in a tree above you and all their hair's bristling with anger, they look enormous. Some of the big males and the females too look huge. And they would be swaying the branches from side to side, and sometimes swaying them so that the tips of the branches hit me. And a couple of times a male raced up behind me and hit my head. But on those occasions I would pretend to be not interested in them at all, and I would dig little holes in the ground, and I'd pretend to eat leaves. And eventually, as I hoped, they kind of realized that, you know, I wasn't frightening and I wasn't threatening and I wasn't going to go away, so they just began to accept me. And so in a way, David introduced me to his friends in the forest. And I got to know those other chimpanzees. I've never known any since as well as I knew David Greybeard and his close friend Goliath. And then there was the old female Flo with her raggedy ears and her bulbous nose and her growing family, which back then was Fabian and Biggin and Fifi, until little baby Flint came along. And there was Mike, who rose from male number 11 in the male hierarchy to be number 1 by his clever use of empty paraffin cans, 4-gallon cans, which he incorporated into his charging display. The charging display is something a male uses to express his dominance and to try and intimidate his rivals. And if you do a really good charging display, you don't have to fight, you can intimidate. And he learned to incorporate 3 of these cans into his charging display and keep them all ahead of him. Well, of course, all the other males rushed out of the way. And he rose to number 1 alpha position, which is highly coveted, within a period of 4 months. And it wasn't obvious he had any serious fights at all. And he reigned for 6 years. So there are differences in the personality and the intelligence of the different chimpanzees. And too, there are good and bad mothers, just as in human society. And the hallmark of a good mother is that she will be affectionate, she'll be tolerant and patient, she will be able to enforce discipline very strongly when it's necessary. She will distract the child if it's doing something wrong, if she can, by grooming or playing, and thus distracting the attention from a child trying to grab a termite tool, for example. She will be playful, this good mother, and above all, she will be supportive. She will support her child, even if it means running in to take the child's part in a squabble with another youngster whose mother is dominant to herself. So she may get attacked, but nevertheless, she will support her child. And that was all the characteristics that our mother had. Same thing, key being supportive. It turns out in chimp society that the youngsters who have these supportive, good mothers have a better start in life. The males tend to rise to a higher social rank. The females tend to be more successful mothers. And those youngsters whose mothers are at the other end of the spectrum tend to grow up to be rather tense and nervous in their interactions with others, and they just don't do as well by and large. So these similarities between humans and chimps, you know, the longer that we study the chimpanzees, the more we realize how like us they are. And looking back over now more than 50 years at the results of this longest unbroken field study of any group of wild animals in the world, which is continuing today. And looking back over it, there are so many dramatic moments, there's so many incredible stories, which I don't have time to share. But the main thing is how like us they are. When they communicate non-verbally, kissing, embracing, holding hands, patting one another for reassurance on the back or the head, reaching out for reassurance after a fight and continuing to be agitated until the hand is gently patted or the anxious youngster is embraced. Begging for a share of food. Chimpanzees hunt. They don't hunt that often, but when they do, the prey is shared, and a young one will beg for a share and sometimes be rewarded. And they have this complex social structure, and what's really fascinating about that is because they travel around in these small groups and then suddenly meet up with others. You can imagine a young male, an adolescent, and he's, there he is, he's got a group of females, maybe a couple of younger males, and he's lording it over them and displaying around and puffing himself up. And then suddenly, one higher-ranking male may join the group, and he's got to instantly change his behavior. Because if he acts like that, he'll be clobbered. So that is, one reason I think why their intellect has been developed, that they've continually got to be changing the way they behave. It was a huge shock when I realized that chimps like us can also be aggressive, violent, and brutal, that the males have a territory, that they patrol this territory in groups of 3 or more, and if they find strangers from a neighboring community, they are likely to attack, and actually so seriously that the victim may die from wounds received. But they can also show love and compassion. And this is particularly between family members, and the bonds between family members are so strong. The female has her first child when she's about 13, and then she'll have one child every 5 years, unless a child dies and then she gets pregnant again more quickly. But it's roughly every 5 years you have a baby. So during that 5 years, the infant is riding on her back and suckling, sleeping with her at night. And then another baby is born, and the older child remains with mum and the little brother or sister. So the bonds between mother and oldest child get stronger, and between the siblings, they begin to develop. And then the next baby is born, the oldest child is about 10 by this time, 10 or 11, and that youngster will be traveling around away from the mother quite a bit, but still coming back and spending a lot of time with the family. And so these bonds get close. And what about the father? Well, we have only recently learned who is the father of which infant through DNA testing of fecal samples. In a way, it's as though all the males act as fathers to all the infants in the group, and they patrol the boundaries of the territory, and they protect the food resources for their females and young. There are no long-lasting pair bonds between non-related adult females. So, love and compassion. Okay, here's a young female named Pom. She's walking through the forest. You don't have the kind of forest here that I'm thinking of, but imagine, some of you know, imagine the vines hanging down, the ferns growing up at the side of the trail. And it's dim, and sunlight is dappling through. And Pom, 9-year-old Pom, adolescent female, she's followed by her little brother Prof. He's been riding on her back, but now he's walking. And the mother is way behind us. And suddenly Pom stops, and she stares fixedly at something ahead of her on the ground, and her hair rises a little bit, which is a sign of fear or excitement. And she gives a little, oh, 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 and rushes up a tree. Well, little Prof, 3 years old, still unsteady on his feet, maybe he didn't hear the sound, or maybe he doesn't know what it means. He carries on along the trail. And his sister is getting more and more agitated, and every hair is bristling with fear. She gets this big grin of fright on her face. Finally, she can't bear it anymore. She rushes down the tree. She picks up her little brother and climbs back up the tree. And that there, coiled up at the side of the trail, is a big poisonous snake. There are hundreds of stories like that. So, love and compassion, but chimpanzees can also show true altruism. Because if you help a family member, so they say that's because you're helping your own genetic survival. But when little Mel lost his mother aged 3, we thought he'd probably die, had no brother or sister who would have adopted him. We've seen this many times. He was all on his own. And although none of the other chimps were mean to him, none of them were particularly loving towards him, until after about 3 weeks, when he was quite weak by this time, a 12-year-old adolescent male is a bit like a human youth of 14, 15, something like that, no relation. Spindle adopted Mel, and he let Mel ride on his back. Even if Mel was cold, let him cling to his belly. And if Mel begged for food, Spindle would share. When little Mel climbed up when Spindle had made his night nest and sat at the edge as though not quite sure of his welcome, with his little Spindle would reach out and draw him close. And even if Mel got too close to socially aroused adult males, the mother's job is to make sure that her infant keeps out of the way until he's learned what's right to do. And when the males are socially aroused, they may kind of lose it, and sometimes as they're charging along, stamping on the ground, hair bristling, lips bunched in a furious scowl, they'll pick up and throw a rock, and they may pick up an infant that gets in the way, though they're not really thinking what they're doing. And Spindle several times rushed in to rescue little Mel, even though he got back buffeted by the big males. And at that age, an adolescent male is usually very careful to keep out of their way in situations like that. So there is no question, Spindle saved Mel's life. It's clear, isn't it, that there isn't a sharp line dividing us from the rest of the animal kingdom. We're part of an amazing animal kingdom. The blurry line between us is getting more and more blurry all the time. And it isn't just chimpanzees. Once you've realized how like us they are in so many ways, then you realize, well, the chimpanzees are very like the other apes, and they're very like the monkeys, and you come on through the animal kingdom and realize that there are characteristics that we all share. And I think one of those characteristics, at least of the higher mammals and birds, is feelings. Louis Leakey made me go to Cambridge. He told me I had to get a degree. He told me that he wouldn't always be around to get money, and I wouldn't be able to get my own money so well if I didn't have a degree. And there was no time to mess about with a BA, he said. I had to go straight for a PhD, and he found me a place in Cambridge University, of all places. So I set off with trepidation, and was told when I got there that I'd done everything wrong, that I should not have given the chimpanzees names, it wasn't scientific, and I couldn't talk about them having personalities or minds or emotions because those were unique to us. Luckily, as a child, I had a wonderful teacher, and that was my dog, Rusty. Some of you have dogs, or cats, or horses. Some of you may have a good relationship with a cow here in Orkney. And if you do, if you really have a bond with an animal, you know perfectly well those professors were wrong. And you know something, I think they didn't believe it themselves. It was just that they didn't have the scientific tools to analyze personality, to analyze emotion. And we're moving in that direction now, although we still have a long way to go. Well, 1986, there I was in Gombe. I was doing a bit of teaching in university. I was writing books. I had this wonderful life. It was my dream come true. And we had a conference in America to which all the different chimpanzee researchers were invited. And there weren't so many back then, but they were studying chimps in different parts of Africa and in some non-invasive situations in captivity. And at that conference, which was mainly about understanding chimp behavior, we had an afternoon session on conservation. And it was utterly shocking to see every researcher coming up with slides about habitat destruction in his area, about the beginning of the hunting of chimpanzees along with all the other animals for food in the bushmeat trade, about chimpanzees being caught in these wire snares that are set by hunters to catch animals to eat. And the chimp may break the snare, but he can't get the wire off his hand or his ankle and may die of gangrene or have a long, slow, lingering and painful period while the hand or foot drops off. And his subsequent reproductive abilities will be crippled by then. So it was pretty shocking to see what was happening, and numbers had plummeted. When I began studying, there were maybe between 1 and 2 million chimps, probably closer to 2 million. Today, there's no more than 300,000, if that, and they're spread across 21 nations. So many of them are in very small populations without too much hope of long-term survival. We also had a session on conditions in captivity, and I'll never forget seeing video of our closest relatives in medical research labs, cages 5 foot by 5 foot, maybe 30, 40 years, alone, with nothing there. These highly intelligent social creatures, it was shocking to see. And taken from their mothers shot in the wild for the pet trade, cruelly trained for circus or entertainment. That was shocking too. And I don't think I made a conscious decision. I'm not aware of having done so. And I always feel it must be rather like St. Paul's Damascus moment, when he was on the road to Damascus and a light came down and he changed. I felt like that. I went in as a scientist to that conference and I came out as an activist. I haven't been more than 3 weeks in any one place since that October 1986, because I felt the chimps had done so much for me. They'd enabled me to live my dream life. I'd written books about them. The books were successful. You know, it was wonderful. I was teaching. But then, now I have to do something to try and help them. I don't know what I can do, but I must try and do something. And so, traveling around in Africa with an exhibition to different chimp range countries, talking with NGOs on the ground, talking to government officials, trying to spread awareness. And as I was traveling around Africa, learning more and more about Africa's problems, about the extent of deforestation, the spread of the desert, the terrible soil erosion, the shrinking water supplies, and not just affecting chimpanzees, but affecting all the other animals living there. And then what about the Africans themselves? Learning more about the crippling poverty, the hunger, the disease, the ethnic violence, and realizing that an awful lot of that was the aftermath of colonialism, and that the big multinationals and some other groups as well are still moving in and exploiting the Africans and their natural resources, and generally leaving greater poverty behind them. It's beginning to change, but back in 1986, it was pretty grim. And thinking, well, it's no good just traveling in Africa. If I want to try and make a difference, I better try talking to people in Europe. We started it with our colonialism. And then what about America with the big multinationals? Better go there. Canada too. And then, well, Asia. We all know what's happening with China and with the Asian countries growing in power. And then, of course, there's South America. So this travel, 300 days a year on the road is crazy. Mary Lewis knows how crazy it is because she helps to do the schedule. She comes to me and says, well, Jane, how can you do that? And I say, well, I can't, but I have to. So traveling around and understanding about what's going on in Africa and realizing that chimpanzees are vanishing. And in 1994, I had the opportunity to fly over the whole of the Gombe area, not just the national park. You have to realize Gombe National Park is very famous now, but it's very small. It's only 30 square miles. If you ironed it, it would be more because it's very mountainous. But it's 30 square miles as the crow flies. And looking down, there was this jewel of forest, like an oasis. But to my horror, outside the boundaries of the park, the hills were completely bare. There were obviously more people living there than the land could support. And they had nowhere to go. They'd overused the land. They were clearly struggling to survive. And this population pressure was all